This is an interactive webinar as well. So you'll see on the right-hand side of your control panel an opportunity to ask questions throughout. There will be time at the end of the webinar to do that. Just flick your questions through there, and I'll pass them on to Cathie and Wendy, who will answer them if we've got time, but hopefully we'll be time for that. Our panellists today are Cathie Heard, who's the Church Planning Wives Coordinator at Geneva Push, and Wendy Potts, who you're going to hear from today, who's the Evangelism Coordinator at Austinmere Anglican. It's a privilege to have you both. Morning, Wendy. Morning, Cathie.
Good morning, Derek. Hi.
Well, I am going to hand over them, and Cathie's going to interview and welcome Wendy for us. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Derek.
Okay, so as Derek said, we're doing this webinar to help us think into how to reach our community with the good news of Jesus. And Wendy's a good person to talk to about this, because this is kind of your job, isn't it, Wendy? It's something that you do professionally, it's almost the wrong word, but you are about helping others learn how to do this better. So I thought it'd be good to hear a little bit about what you do, what's your actual work.
Yeah, sure. I am pretty blessed to call this my job. I go around to different churches across denominations offering training in evangelism and speaking evangelistically at events, and I have been available to work with churches in a consultancy and strategic planning role, but I also work part-time with my own local church, Austinmere Anglican, and so I get to work things out on the ground over time with them and in relationships that last. So it's a really beautiful mix, and I one way or another, I guess I've been thinking hard about evangelism for about 25 to 30 years now, over a few different seasons of life and with a lot of great teachers. So yeah, God's been teaching me lots over those years.
So we look forward to hearing some of your thinking. And we've chosen this topic especially for Planter Wives because I think something that can happen is by planting a church, obviously our passion is to take the gospel to our nation. But at the same time, I think many of us start a church whilst at the same time feeling quite inadequate to actually do the work of evangelism, and can sometimes get to the point where we feel a bit ashamed, almost like we're a fake. So here we are starting a new church with our husband. Our big goal is to reach the community, but the reality is evangelism is actually something we really struggle with. And I think that's very common. And so it would be great to chat with you about that. So just with that initial thinking, Wendy, what would be some things that you would say to a person like me who's in that position to get past that?
I think the first thing to say is that don't worry if you find it difficult, because we all do. And, I get to call this my job because I do love evangelism, but I find it hard. And I've been encouraged to hear from others who I admire as evangelists, and they say it's hard. So don't let that disqualify you if you find it hard, because Jesus said it was going to be hard. And even the Apostle Paul, you look at where he asks for prayer. In Ephesians chapter 6, he says, please pray for me that I would declare the gospel fearlessly as I should. In Romans 1:16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel is almost a self-talk. It's like, I'm not going to be ashamed of the gospel because I know it's the power of God. And in Colossians, he talks about praying. He asks them to pray that he would declare the gospel clearly. And so those are things that I pray for myself as well. And I think to add to that, the longer that we've been a Christian, the more foreign the world can feel, and the more we end up retreating if we're not careful, the less non-Christians we know, and the less confident we can get. And so when we recognise that dynamic, we need to actively turn that around and start being in the world in a healthy way.
Okay, so we'll chat more about that. So have you got other thoughts as to how to sort of get past this?
Sure, yeah. So I guess after recognising that we all find it difficult, then I think recognising that God has made you who you are, you're unique, and learning to be secure in the personality, in the gifts, in the context that God's given you uniquely, and recognise that He's he's in the business of using ordinary people like us to change the world. He doesn't need to use us, but he chooses to use ordinary people like us. And you look at the fishermen at the very beginning, how ordinary they were, and yet, and then he continues to have done that down through the generations. And so I think as we become more secure in who God has made us to be, which is where time's on our side. As you get older, you start to know Jesus more, sense that he's at work in and through you despite yourself, and then use what God has given you. So, for example, I've spent many years evangelising side by side with a dear friend who I admire a lot because she's so warm and humorous and vibrant, and I often thought, oh gosh, I wish I was more humorous like she was. And she often thought, I wish I was more bold like Wendy was. And when we recognised it's okay, I'm not her and she's not me, and God uses us for who we are. Use what God has given you in terms of seasons of life. So whether you're a city worker or I was in one season of life, that was how my evangelism looked, was side by side with the people I worked alongside of, whether I was a ministry staff worker on a uni campus and I had all the time in the world to share the gospel, or whether I was a mother pushing swings at the park. They're different seasons, or whether I'm in a church job. They're different seasons and circumstances. So use what you've got. And, you know, we've got a great garden where we live, and we use it a lot for hospitality, for having people over. But look at what God's given you and use it. I think the other thing to say would be to be proactive and learn to be the initiator in relationships with people. And so look around us, look up, don't concentrate on my own sense of insecurity, but recognise that others feel insecure too. So be the first to say hello, be the first to start a conversation with someone. I used to be really shy until I realised that other people were too. And then open your home, invite people for dinner, invite, rather than just saving the inviting for evangelistic events, just invite people to do stuff with you, like, you know, go to the markets up the road, or go to the cafe, or go to the park together. Be the person that takes the initiative in relationship. And then I think the overarching principle is to really love people. I think there's nothing that beats genuinely loving people. So everyone's different in their capacity, so introverts or extroverts. But I think that the love is it's Jesus's basic command, isn't it? Love one another and they'll know you're my disciples. And so as we love each other, I think that speaks volumes as we love the world. And then actually genuinely spending time with people and seeing people through God's eyes, no longer judging them in worldly ways. And that deep love for people overcomes the fear barrier, I think.
And that's not a natural thing, I think. I actually have caught myself realising I probably don't love people as much as ideally you would think a Christian would. So it is something to pray for. It's not necessarily natural, I think.
It definitely.
What have you done to help yourself in looking around people in your community and actually have a sense of love for them?
Sometimes it's as simple as thought experiments when you're in a crowd of people and you just stop yourself for a moment and you can recognise that you might, how you look people up and down and you see what they're wearing, or you kind of imagine their stories, and then you stop yourself from judging in a worldly way and say that person is made in the image of God, precious and known to the Creator, probably lost from God, but deeply loved, and God's heart is for them to know him. Now, I can do that with complete strangers on a train and no conversation might happen, but it's almost like training my brain to think God's way. And at some level it comes automatically, doesn't it, with maturity in Christ, and we would want that to keep growing, of course, as we grasp God's heart for people, then it becomes natural. But sometimes, it's just our sinful nature or our selfish nature or our worldly nature takes over and we don't think that way.
That's helpful. So a lot of what you're saying, you're talking about us being givers, actually, aren't you? So we're the ones to take initiative, we're the ones to reach out, we're the ones to give love.
Yeah.
And I guess umbrella under that is assuming on a sovereign God who will choose to use us no matter how inadequate our gifts are, and just use us for who we are. That kind of sums up what we've been saying.
Yeah. I think the sovereignty of God is such a big thing too, and over time, as God gives us little glimpses of how he uses us unexpectedly and how he brings people across our paths who, you know, despite me thinking the rest of the world is hostile and isn't interested in the gospel, he reminds me now and then that, or a lot of the time, he reminds me that people are hungrier than I give them credit for, or more willing to search than I often think they will be. And so, and remembering that in the sovereignty of God, it doesn't all have to happen on my shift, in that conversation, in that one moment. I've learned to relax because of the sovereignty of God and know that just breathe, Lord, use me now, help me to be wise now, and trust that it doesn't all have to happen right now. And then that helps you just not speak with this high-pitched voice that's suddenly burning with the urgency of their eternity in your hand in this minute.
Yeah.
God is bigger.
So even in that, you've got intentionality because you're actually thinking to pray as you start speaking. And I've noticed the times I've done that, it's been very helpful. Another thing I've noticed is I'm likely to get asked certain questions. I can almost bet at some point someone will say to me, "What does your husband do?" And
yes.
It's taken me a while, but I've realised that really if I thought carefully about good answers to some of the questions I'm likely to be asked, that would also be quite a helpful technique. So can I ask you, if just imagine you're a church planter wife, okay, so if someone said to you, "What does your husband do?" What's some good ways, I'll share some thoughts I've had, but what are some good ways that that question could be answered that would actually be salty in a conversation?
Yeah, I think to be aware that the word church and the word Christian can often immediately put barriers up. So to be thinking about ways to explain what it is you mean without necessarily jumping straight to those words, although I don't avoid those words the whole time, but I usually don't tell people I'm an evangelist because I don't think that's going to help. But what I do is explain that I work with the church up the road, and then I might explain my job is to help the church connect with the community. My job is to help people who are seeking to understand the meaning of life, to look at the life of Jesus and to check him out firsthand, to make sense of what relevance that has today. I had a wonderful opportunity on the soccer field a few years ago with a girl that I just sat next to, a complete stranger. We both had dogs, so we were sitting away from everybody else just to stop the dogs being annoying. And I chatted with her first about what she did. She worked in a Northern Territory remote community with Indigenous people. She'd just come home to Austinmere, and so that was really interesting, and we were connecting on that. And then, of course, she asked me, what do I do? And as I, going through my head, how do I say this in a way that's not going to shut down the conversation? I just explained a few of the things that were going on at our church in terms of community and intergenerational women meeting with women and events that we put on and those sorts of things. And as I explained it, her reaction was really beautiful. She, unbeknownst to me, I thought she'd sort of shut down, but she actually said, "That's really beautiful, and what I've seen in the remote communities is what's missing here." The grandparents looking out for their teenage children and their interaction of the whole community loves it when it gets on board when people are going astray. So that kind of thing opened up the conversation. But what about you?
Yeah, so I think it's actually a good question. So you guys that are listening in, and think of the obvious questions you get asked and how can you answer them in a way that opens up conversation. I used to make the mistake you're speaking of. I used to say things like, "Oh, my husband works, he's a minister of a church." And nothing. I think a bit better is something like my husband helps people with finding meaning in life, or my husband helps people in finding out what life is actually about. My husband helps people with investigating the claims Jesus made about himself, or my husband helps people find out more about who Jesus really is. Yeah, so I think something that means there could be some obvious next questions like, oh, well, who is that? Or, oh, what is the meaning of life? And sometimes they may not be, but I think if anyone's curious, you've at least helped them with that next question if they are genuinely curious. And that's what we want to do, isn't it, is make opportunities. If someone is genuinely seeking, or God's got his hand on them, then you've given something for them to take hold of, rather than shutting, and there's nothing to take hold of. I think that's it. One of the key things is saying things in a way that raises curiosity, and I think that's what you've just demonstrated. You're like, I'll take a second glance, and what do you mean by that? And and then it starts a conversation. Yeah, and I think the other thing that you've mentioned before, which I've discovered too late in doing this, is asking them lots of questions about their thinking. Is that something that you have seen as well, is helpful to do? Yeah, I think I'm not naturally good at that, but it's something I really know that I need to work at, and I'm convinced that it's really a key for building curiosity and building conversation. And the reason is because when you ask questions of somebody else, what you're doing is you're showing that you care about them. You're not instantly saying, I want to download my lecture to you. I'm reining in the conversation here. You're actually saying, I want to know you. And that's expressing respect, it's expressing interest. And love. And then and love, exactly. The time that is given to listening, definitely. And then, of course, that reveals the worldview of the person that you're talking to. If you're asking them what matters to them, even if it's simple things like, what do you hope your children are going to do with their life, or what do your children love, what are they good at, and you start to build a picture of their life and their values. If you're asking more intentional things about their spiritual beliefs, then of course you get those clearer answers. And it guides the conversation too. You can direct the conversation by asking the questions. So if you have got a few well thought out questions, like when it's timely to say something as direct as, what about you? Do you have any spiritual beliefs? Have you grown up with religion? Is it something you've left behind? What is the basis of what you believe? Why do you believe that? Those kinds of direct questions that are gentle and respectful then raise curiosity, and they're likely to ask you back. And there's your opportunity to share what you believe. Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've learned is one question isn't enough. So asking my initial question, but then lots of follow-up questions, not probing, interrogating, and a little bit of light sharing on the way. But light sharing, not here's the download lecture of what the true meaning of life is. Yes. Yeah, which is just conversation, isn't it? It's learning the give and take of conversation. Yeah, that's helpful. Look, I'm going to ask you another question, a big question. It's kind of an elephant in the room for me, which is, say, go back to the church planter wife, because many listening in are exactly in that position. You're about to start a new church. You've got a launch team of 30 people who you're looking after in some way, lots of hospitality, lots of meetings. You have this new church starting, so there's lots of work to do, lots of setting up. You've got heaps of people coming to your church, hopefully. You're meeting lots of new people there, lots of hospitality, lots of people. How on earth do you fit in meeting people out in the community in evangelism? And I think that's so what do you do? Yeah, I think obviously the juggle of people is always in ministry going to be a question. It's a question in life, but for everybody, but especially in ministry. But I think one of the problems is that we can often compartmentalise
the way we think about life and the way we think about ministry. Like we might think of meeting to read the Bible one-on-one with a team member as ministry, and then non-ministry stuff is going grocery shopping or in an exercise class. But when we understand that evangelism is really not just an elective on the side, a unit that we might take at university or do at a conference or in a webinar, evangelism is who we are because of who we know, and we know that God's heart beats for the lost, and we know that Jesus came for the lost. We know we are the lost that has been found, and that he involves us in the great ministry of reconciling the world to himself. When we get that in our core, then I think the really important principle that Paul teaches us in Corinthians about all of life is about integrating, giving glory to God and the salvation of others. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. And he says that in the context of I'll remove any barriers from the gospel for the sake of many to be saved. Follow me as I follow Christ. So it's that core principle that it's part of who we are, it's in our DNA. And then it frees us from that sense of, oh, now I'm on evangelism time, and then I'm on church ministry time, and then I'm, now I'm on home family ministry time. You actually just think all of life is ministry, and so it makes it just part of our everyday.
Yeah, so there does need to be a switch in thinking, which is reaching people for the gospel all the time. But once you've got that, then it's not like a compartment, is what you're saying. It's just, it should then flow. And everything you're doing is showing off who Jesus is, hopefully.
And so it's just a part of who we are. So wherever I am, grocery shopping or exercise class or meeting up with someone intentionally to explore the life of Jesus, it's all a part of just being myself.
Now, I will just say to people listening in, you can actually ask questions. We're going to leave about 25 minutes near the end. And so if some of these things are raising questions for you, type them in, and we'll do our best to get to them as we go. But there's a couple of more things I just want to get Wendy for us and get out there. One is a verse that I know is a bit of a favourite of yours, Wendy, is in Thessalonians, where Paul says, we loved you so much that we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well, because you had become so dear to us. So give me a feel for what you love in that verse. First of all.
Okay. I just love that Paul expresses that it's hand in hand with doing life. You share the gospel. It's not sitting down with someone for an hour to open up the Bible. It's doing life together. And as you live and breathe Jesus, more is caught than is taught. And so it's not just compartmentalized like I was just talking about. So it's loving people, living Jesus and sharing Jesus in our words and in our actions all together.
Yeah. Now, it's helpful to kind of reflect that when Paul wrote that, he may have only been with the Thessalonians, a short time. So sharing life can sometimes sound like you need to be with people in their lives every day for 10 years. He must have meant something slightly different, because he wasn't there much longer, maybe than several weeks. But he does then talk about sharing his life. So I do wonder what he meant by sharing his life when it was that short time. Have you got? Yeah,
that's a really good point. I mean, I know that when we talked about this, was it last night, you made a really good point about that, and I love the thought that you brought up, that sharing our lives isn't necessarily the intensity of 10 years day by day. It's about the quality of how we share personally our lives. Do you want to expand on that a bit more?
Yeah, because I was responding to something that I thought was good, which is, as you were saying, people are not projects. And I think initially I did have that. I wouldn't have said it so crassly, but it probably was how it was coming out. And so in my fervent desire to share the gospel, I would download too much information all in one go. And I also might be a bit like a teacher or a lecturer.
Yeah, because you work so hard on your answers.
I would, investigate the 20 questions most likely to be asked and make sure I knew the answers thoroughly, and so equip myself for evangelism, which is a good thing. But then I would be running around and giving everyone the full answers to those questions, and it's quite often too much. And so I think one of the changes, and you're reflecting on this, one of the changes that I've made recently is to realise that sharing my life is a little bit about sharing with people what Jesus means for me personally. And that's probably going to open a lot more doors than sharing slabs of doctrine, which there is a place for and there's going to be a need for at some point, but early on. I was trying to think, what is it about the gospel that I can share with people that's personal? So I have a few lines, and like to hear yours too, but I was thinking things like, what is it about the gospel that comforts me? That I sit in a funeral and there's so much about the gospel that comforts me. What is it about that I could actually pass on? What are the many ways Jesus has given meaning to my life? And that, pass that on. Why is it that I don't freak out when I watch the news every night? What is it about the good news of Jesus that's really precious to me? And it's that personal thought that I think people, they're looking for the difference it's made to you. That's what they're interested in. They may take it on, but they're interested in why you like it.
Absolutely. I think that's the thing. And I was saying to you the other night, I think that's when the lights go on in conversations with people, is when I become passionate, when I share the difference that Jesus actually makes, and my love of Jesus, or something of the spark of what makes my heart sing, somebody said, comes through in that conversation. And I think that's what Paul also is talking about. As you said, he's only spent 3 weeks or so with the Thessalonians. It's sharing the life of Jesus and what difference that makes to us. And so I remember a while ago having the difference very clearly laid out when I was having a conversation with another mother who I had sought to share spiritual things with at some points over our relationship. But it was when I shared with her that I was vulnerable with her. And it was when I shared that I got anxious about my kids over some aspect of their behaviour or something going on in their lives. I watched the lights go on for her, and then I was able to share the comfort of being able to pray, being able to trust God with that, being able to ask God for God's wisdom, whatever it was. But it was relevance and the connection that made, the relevance to her life. Instead of me lecturing her on the finer points of doctrine.
And I think we're not great at doing that because it takes a little bit of self-reflection. What is it that I love about the gospel? So here we go, those of you that are listening in, it is to self-reflect. What is the meaning that Jesus has given to your life? What are the things that are great comforts to you in the gospel? And if you can actually speak in those personal terms, if we can do that more and more, I think we become more real to people. Here's the other thing that I think that can happen is we become, well, let me flip. When I'm lecturing, I think I come across as self-righteous and arrogant. And one of the problems is we do have the good news, we have the right news, we're on the right side. And so all of that can convey an air of superiority. Whereas when we're about the difference it's made to us, and in that I think we make ourselves, we show our vulnerability and we show where the weaknesses are, and I think we need to do that more and more. There's a humility in that comes through. And humility is attractive. And
absolutely.
It's showing, because of course the gospel is us being dependent. So instead of looking arrogant and superior, I think we then look, well, it's more obvious the humble side. And I think that's bits we need to work on in our relationships with people, is humility, as we're talking.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that because of the misunderstanding of the gospel in our culture, people mostly think that you say you're a Christian, you think you're going to heaven, that means you must be good enough for heaven. It's the upside down gospel. And so they assume us to be thinking we're superior and right, and really the real understanding of the gospel is I'm flawed, I'm broken, I need forgiveness, I need a saviour. And so grace sets us free to be real about that.
Yeah,
and
exactly. Inadvertently, we actually can sort of underline their former opinion that we think we're right.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that builds the barriers.
Now, last big question before we start listening to and answering some questions that are coming through. So feel free to write questions that are coming through. Write questions and send them through. The last thing is, for those of us who are starting new churches, we long to see everyone in our church also on about evangelism. So, who are married, plan to wives, how do we get women in our church to be evangelizing? How do we get others to capture the same vision of doing this?
Well, okay, there's lots of things to say, but I'll put them into three categories: modelling, creating culture, and teaching skills. So I think modelling, first of all, what you model as one of the leaders is actually going to be watched. And so if we don't grow ourselves in our love for the lost and nurture that love, both with, just simply remaining in Christ and he remaining in us, and we will bear much fruit, that love that overflows, then others won't be passionate about that too. And so part of the way, and I think you said this, people aren't necessarily going to be watching you on the soccer field when you have a one-on-one conversation with your child's friends' parents, but you can model by the way that you share excitedly about the things that are going on and what's God's doing in your week. Despite your weaknesses and your best attempts, even if they're flawed, and your prayers and the excitement of seeing God at work unexpectedly, bringing people across your path. I think that models a lot.
Sorry, here's something I was just thinking then. So you're talking about the soccer field, and I was remembering, so the first point's really helpful, just to underline. People won't necessarily see you having attempts to talk with people about Jesus. They won't, so you're not modelling in that way, but the modelling is you talking about what you did, which is helpful. But do you think modelling failures is helpful too? I was just thinking sometimes on the soccer field, I would go down, so we're talking years ago when my kids were that young, but I'd go down and sometimes I would be really keen to talk to people about anything, and I'd be standing there and there would be this little group and they would turn so their back was to me and I would just be left out of the conversation, and it would be it was just me, but quite often I felt I've got all the intentions in the world, but it's actually quite hard because there's all these natural social skills you need to have, and people need to like you, and all of these can be hurdles as well. It's not really even just gospel things, they're just people things.
And often it is just spending time building trust, building relationships, patiently breaking through the barriers that people have in their heads about you if they've made up their mind you're the church planter's wife and they don't really want to know about Jesus.
It's quite tricky. So I don't know, but I did sometimes tell people in my church about those things, and I think in a weird way they liked that.
And exactly. Our failed attempts or our missed opportunities. I was at the cafe the other day, and one of the dads from the school who's taken a few months off work and so has time on his hands, was also grabbing a coffee. And as I walked in, he said, "Oh, Wendy would be able to answer that." So I'm known in the community as professional Christian person. And I said, oh, I tuned in because he obviously let me tune in. And I said, what's that? What are you talking about? And he said, oh, I was just up till 4 a.m. last night finishing off one of my son's religion assignments. So that was funny. But then we got talking about what was the assignment and that it was about church martyrs. So his kid goes to a Catholic school and he'd been interested in it enough to stay up till 4 a.m. So that was a conversation waiting to happen, and we started on it a little bit, but I kind of, didn't want to take over, and I was a little bit less jumping into the conversation. In hindsight, I thought of all the things I could have said to have a really good, solid conversation about that.
Yeah, what do you think you can do when you do go away from conversations and you start to think of all the good things you really could have said?
Yeah.
So what do you do in that?
Well, that's part of the training, isn't it? That's the self-training where you actually reflect. Like you said, we're not necessarily good at reflecting, but that's where a lot of the best learning happens. I sat in the car and I thought, oh my goodness, the obvious place to go with that conversation was people gave their lives for this message. And why would they give their lives? They must have thought it was pretty important. Life-changing, in fact. And people are doing that today. I could have gone that direction. And next time I see him, I will be able to pick up on that because it's a community. I'm in relationship. It's long-term. It doesn't need to happen in that one conversation right then. So that's the best thing about long-term relationships, isn't it? You can pick up and go, I was thinking about that conversation we had.
Yes, don't be afraid to do that. That's good. Now, you also mentioned creating culture in your church. Like, have you got thoughts about how a person can create that culture?
Yeah, so building on the modelling thing and then expanding that. You're one person modelling, but there's such value in the body of Christ modelling to each other. And so I learn so much from listening to others as we grapple together with how to share Christ with our friends. And so just as we're talking now and others are listening in and probably thinking things that they would like to say, when we do that in our home groups, we're actually creating courage, creating a sense of, I'm not the only one that struggles. Yeah. Creating determination and conviction that comes from the Word of God and the Spirit of God. But also we are hearing, when we ask the questions, for instance, we've started most of our Bible studies lately asking the simple question, where have you seen God at work lately? And that simple positive question gives a format for us to then share the wonderful things that God is doing. Week by week, there are things God is doing. As one of the girls talked about, she walks after she drops the kids to school, and every day when she walks, she prays for people that she's come across. And if she sees people that she asks them if they'd like to walk with her, and then it's an intentional opportunity. It's just half an hour after school. It's not a big time commitment, but it's either praying for people or inviting them to walk with her and just seeing where God takes that. So I thought, that's beautiful.
Yeah. So what you've done is it's an agenda, it's the agenda in growth groups, and so by having it as an agenda, it's just raising that culture. That's what you talk about, that's what people share, and they just learn from that. It becomes part of the DNA.
Yeah, and so recently a beautiful example was that one of the girls was sharing about somebody she had been praying for with her home group, and who had been going through some particularly difficult crises in her life, and somebody else in the home groups asked her, have you asked whether she would like you to pray with her? And she said, I shouldn't have let that throw me, but it really did throw me. I should have thought of it myself, but it seemed to be a huge step to take. But the fact that another girl in the group said, what about you ask if she wants to pray with you, not just ask if you want to pray for her. So she took that brave step next time, and then she reported back that it was amazingly well received, and that led on to sharing Bible verses through texts, and that led on to the woman saying, that was so beautiful, send me some more, and then that led on to inviting her to church, and she actually came and loved it. So those beautiful interactions that happen when we work together.
You're working together and you're helping each other. That's very helpful. Now, I'm just going to pause in case there are some questions. Yeah, so there's one that's just come through that would be worth just touching on. How do you balance relational evangelism and the running of evangelistic events? I guess it's how do you weigh up the two options there? And what is it that makes events work? Because I think we're all used to putting on events and 2 non-Christians come and 100 Christians, and then the non-Christians enjoy doing the craft, but you never see them again. That's the worst scenario. How do you actually make events do the job they're meant to do? Yeah, because
that's a great,
yeah. The first part of that was balance of relational and event-based.
Well, I think really that's such a good question, and grappling with that balance, because they both rely on the other. We can put on events and nobody turns up because we don't have relationships, or we don't have relationships of depth or trust, or where good conversations are happening anyway. You can invite 1,000 people, but they might not come because they don't really know you intimately enough. So but then you can also have really good relationships that you never really cross the bridge and get to the core of the gospel, because either you don't feel equipped or confident, or the opportunity just doesn't seem to be there. And so that's where the blessing of having somebody communicate the gospel at an event in a way that somebody can be in the crowd and it's not so pointed, but it's clear and communicated in an engaging way. That's where you can be the inviter. So those two things really have to work together. And so you can go off, as a partnership, And so I think creating events that people are confident to bring their friends to is part of the balance. So having a sense of engaging with your community on things that you know they'll love to come to. And we've worked hard at that over the last 10 or 15 years at our church. And so over time we've gone from little events of 40 to 50 people to bigger events, and people in the community looking forward to the next women's event that we put on. It's unapologetically sharing Jesus, but it's also, beautiful, aesthetically beautiful. There's a glass of champagne, there's something interesting happening. It's women getting together of all ages and enjoying each other's company, talking about meaningful things. We're doing it in such a way that we think our friends will love to come to it, but we're making sure we're upfront about the gospel element.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think one of the things that sometimes people can do is put on events but not have done a really good lead up for everyone to get ready for the event. And relational evangelism is the lead up, isn't it? And relational evangelism takes a long time. But really, you need to know about the event months and months before, a long relational lead up where people are praying and being asked, have you invited your friend, or are you actually me being able to invite your friend, that kind of,
Absolutely, and I think that if it's part of the culture all the time, then that flows one from another.
Yeah, so one of the things I was just reflecting, we hope to hold a life course in the day next February. So we're actually going to talk to women about it now and be praying every week for who we can be inviting to that event in February. So I know I would need that long lead up to even get anyone near being ready.
That's beautiful, yep.
The other thing is to have different kinds of events. So life may be a bridge way too far for some of our friends, but there's carols in between, there's Summerfest in between. So you sort of choose which event will I bring which friend to.
Yes. So having a variety of things on that are connectors, that are actually engagers, and that are really preaching the gospel clearly. Yep.
Yeah. And I like what you said, not daggy. That's what I took from what you said about that beautiful daggy, so cool. That is such a killer.
I know the fluoro lights and the mashed potato, and it's. I know it's not all about the packaging, but honestly, women are aesthetic beings, and we something about just creating a home, creating a space, creating a vibe. Sometimes that actually does speak about love. It also expresses love, and people often go away from the events that we've done like that and go, that was just beautiful. We just loved every minute of it.
That's worth the effort. Hey, can I ask you, how long does it take you to get into a meaningful conversation with someone where you actually are close and can talk with them about the gospel? So someone's put in a question similar to that, so I'm just rephrasing it. Yeah, how long personally does it take you to get to that point?
Oh, it's such a variety. I mean, you can't just say one answer to that, but look, I've lived in this community for 18 years, and there's some people that I'm having meaningful long-term relationships with over the 18 years, and we can bounce in and out of meaningful points when crises hit or when they raise it. But I'm not always having meaningful conversations with them because it would just be way too intense. I've got to just balance that out. And there are others like sitting on the soccer field, another situation with the husband of a friend of mine, and I never had found out before what he did with his career, and we got talking and he asked me what I do, and we had that conversation, and I ended up talking about the gospel with him through that in this one-off conversation that I never expected it to happen right then and there. So it's just a range.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay.
It's building trust.
Yeah, and yeah, I guess how often you see them, the kind of person they are, how well you click. There's lots of factors in that, isn't there?
There is. It's hard to give one answer. Sorry, that's not very helpful.
No, I think that's the right answer, really. How do we, do you think, recognise when it's not just us converting them, pushing to convert them, but God is leading us? That's the question that's being asked. So how would you answer that? So I'll just say it again, so it's just get your mind around it. How do we recognise when God is the one leading us and it's not just us trying to convert them? I've got thoughts there, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, okay. So I think, I mean, along with Paul at the end of Acts, I always want someone to become a Christian. And if somebody asks me directly, that is my agenda because I love them. I want the best for them. But in terms of recognising and sensing where they're at, I also want to treat people with gentleness and respect. I can't make them want Jesus, and so or understand the gospel or be receptive. So that's recognising the sovereignty of God and the heart work of the Spirit. So I think recognising I like to put it in terms of red lights, orange lights and green lights in conversation, and being sensitive and wise to how the conversation is going. When somebody puts up a red light, if I'm going towards spiritual things, then the respectful thing is to back off. And it's not going to help to push my gospel agenda. It's only going to put barriers up. And so if I feel that's happening, I'll just back off, but I'll not back off the friendship, I'll back off the God talk. They still know that I'm a Christian, that I love them, that Jesus is a part of my life, but I'm not going to push it until they're ready. But if I get an orange light, it's different. If I get an orange light, it's like it could go either way, and I'll raise things that might arouse conversation and curiosity, or I'll just keep gently looking for opportunities along that relationship. And if I get a green light, well, then you know when people are hungry. Recently, the cleaner at our church, who wasn't a Christian, she was in tears over the vacuum cleaner. We had this moment together that it was obvious to me God was tapping her on the shoulder, and she was receptive to that conversation going further. And it would have been sinful for me not to take it further because she was open and ready. It's about that, learning that wisdom and sensitivity to people's conversations.
Yeah, so there's a few things you've said that I think are very helpful principles, which is that we don't actually know who God's chosen. So just just be open to everybody, like take the word to everyone, and that's the instruction we're given from the Bible, to take the gospel to everyone. But then you're being sensitive. The sensitivity is how receptive are they, and you're looking for the signals, and red and orange, green is a helpful way to think of it, and respectfully responding to the signals they give you. And we assume that when there's a green, we take that because that's God leading, this person's ready, and go for it.
Yeah, exactly.
We're both, it's God and you working together.
There's this beautiful partnership, and yeah, I think that's a really helpful thing to keep talking about, because the partnership between us and God, which God allows us to, you know, the privilege and the joy of partnering with him, and then the partnership with us and others in the church. You recognise, and this is what we were going to talk about too, the interweaving of the church community. So this partnership then, it's not all in one moment. It's us working together with the Spirit of God, and when we, just being sensitive to those moments. Sorry, I'm going off track. You tell me where you want to go with this.
Well, I think the next question will bring in the thought that we're not alone in evangelism, that it's a bit of a whole church event. So I'll give you the question. Quite often women can be good at connecting with women. So I know, although I started the webinar saying it's something we're ashamed that we're not good at, sometimes we're better at it than the guys are, so that's not very hopeful, is it? And it is true. For some reason, I think women, on the whole, do tend to respond to the gospel. So you often have more women being converted, at least initially. Now, have you got thoughts on how a church can go beyond the wife being converted, or beyond the wife being connected with, to the husband and family that she is coming from? Have you got thoughts about how a church can go deeper and reach the whole family?
Yeah, and that's great, because that's recognising that God is not just at work between the one-on-one relationship that we might be thinking about. God is in the business of bringing households to himself, and networks of people to himself, and so when we recognise that early up, we're conscious not just of the woman that we might have built a friendship with, but who is in her family. So it might be that, I mean, hospitality is the obvious way to go there. Initially, you know, you're inviting them over to your house, opening your home, and with your husband and with your family, if those connections are obvious, if that's a good way to go. But then the broader church, creating opportunities just for Christians and non-Christians, friends, to come together in all sorts of ordinary, normal contexts. So whether it be something as organised as a street party, which we do once a year in our back garden, we host it, we invite the whole street and whoever comes, and there's a bunch of Christians in our street and there's a bunch of non-Christians, or whether it's just barbecue, you know, or game of soccer down the park, or hanging out at the beach together, but organising, creating those opportunities for Christians and non-Christians to be together and being prayerful and intentional in the lead up. We've done that with our gingerbread house events. Do you want me to talk about that? Or?
Well, can I just sum up a couple of points you've made so we don't lose them, because I think they're very helpful. But what you're saying there is churches need to be mindful not just of having events for women, but of having events that whole families can come to. But also individuals need to be aware of, if the wife is connecting with the wife, that's great, but what can she do next for the whole family to connect with the whole family? So it's that intentionality of individually doing hospitality events that can include whole families once you've made your initial wife-to-wife connection, but then the whole church doing events that connect with whole families. What can whole families come to, or what can men come to? wife events. Yeah, give us.
Yeah, and not just come to, but the relationship beyond an event is really the core, isn't it? So it's building those natural community relationships beyond the one-on-one, so into the families.
So an example, I was at the soccer field and getting to know the coach and his wife, invited the wife to a few things. Now, Andrew is too busy to help me on the soccer field and had too many people in our house to think in terms of doing hospitality with yet another family. But there was another Christian family who also had their son in the same soccer team. They went to our church, and they were able to do hospitality with this family and invite them to some church things. I also invited the wife. And so there was this nice partnership between this family and church, and myself and Andrew to a certain extent, but less than what they were able to give. And yeah, eventually this couple became Christian, and then their children became Christian, and that's a wonderful story. They're very high.
That's beautiful. That's a beautiful example, exactly. And I think that also recognises that the pastor and his wife are not the ones that do the evangelism only. It's a whole church work, and you're actually almost, it's like delegating. You're saying, you know, let's get on board with this together. And because my husband is not well, we're not able to do a whole lot of couplesy things together. So I'm in a similar situation in some ways, especially if there's a woman that I've been, a lot of women who I've had relationships of content, of spiritual content with. I'm stuck when it comes to inviting their husbands over. So I'll invite another couple from church, or I'll ask that other couple from church to host something that we can all come to and build bridges so that it's not just about me.
Yeah, and so that makes sense. Like if you're going to join a play group or join a gym or maybe if there's a few of you from church doing it at the same time and you're playing off each other, or not playing off each other, but working together, that's helpful.
Yeah.
We're coming near the end. Can I just ask you quickly, have you ever had the need to maybe you've gone so far with a person and it's so clear they do not want the gospel? Do you ever sort of think I need to move on and stop investing so much time? Because you're one person, there are others out there that want to hear the gospel, and you know, do you ever sort of think I need to move on and put my time and energy into other people?
Yeah, it's a real heart wrench, and that's one of the costs, I think, the emotional cost of evangelism is the heart wrench when people, despite the love that you have for them and the longing and the prayers, that you don't see them responding. And that's where I think, yes, to some extent, you never give up on them completely, because I think your expression of friendship has to go beyond whether they become a Christian or not. Your love for them has to be genuinely a love for them, like God's love for us, for his world. But in terms of investing that intensity of time, I think that there is a time and a place for not sowing endlessly into an unreceptive soil. And really, I think Jesus did allow us that when he said that sounds quite harsh, but wipe the dust off your feet and move on. Go look for that person of peace who is receptive. He was saying to the disciples in that first mission.
Yeah, and I think you're limited. We're limited and finite, and there's only so much time. So it's partly recognising that, isn't it? And not thinking I have to do all things to everybody.
Exactly. And the beautiful thing that sometimes happens, and God doesn't always let us see the other end of the story in these cases, but I've got a lovely example to end on. When I was working in advertising in the city years and years ago, my boss and his wife became very good friends, and we did a lot of really good relational evangelism, I suppose, with them. We loved them. We went on weekends away together. We invited them to evangelistic events. We had meaningful conversations, and they were politely uninterested. They liked us, but they didn't want Jesus. Years and years later, I got messages via other Christian friends from the other side of Sydney saying, Vanessa wants to let you know she has become a Christian, another 8 years later.
Oh, wow.
And when I had we'd stayed in touch for years, and then it had gradually changed, and I had let go of any hope that they would come to Christ really, and we'd moved on and lived geographically apart. God was still at work in their lives. And to the point that they ended up both becoming Christians, both selling their high-powered advertising agency, selling their Chatswood home, going to work in a mission capacity in France, way beyond what I could have ever asked or imagined, you know. So God was still at work, and He didn't give up. And I didn't give up. I just sort of thought, I can't keep going in the same intensity.
Great story to end. Yeah. Thank you so much. Now, Wendy's available for churches to come and share some of this stuff and do training and skilling up. So yeah, keep that in mind. But I think it's just helpful to think into personally how we do this in our church. And I think the big thing is just love and intentionality and relating, and the gospel being real to us and being able to share the reality and relevance of it in our lives with others. So I think that's been really helpful points that you've brought out. All under God's sovereignty, which is, that last story was a great reminder of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cathie, and it's so lovely to talk to you, and I've equally learnt a lot from your examples and your reflections, so I think that's an example of what we do in our churches, isn't it? Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye then.
Bye-bye.
And bye everyone else, I think. I'll hand over to Derek, I think. Is that right?
Thanks, Cathie. That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cathie, and thank you, Wendy. That was fantastic. That was really practical. Just as we finish, if you'll indulge us, we're just going to have a quick poll to test out some new technology we've got here. It should come up on your screen, hopefully. Are you planning a summer evangelistic event, or is your church planning a summer event? Just answer that quickly while I just remind you that we are sponsored by EA Insurance, so head over there afterwards. Now, you can catch all of the... Oh, here we go. 50% yes, 50% no. Gee, that's right down the middle, isn't it? All right. Well, you can catch the next webinars or catch up on this webinar on our website, genevapush.com/planter sessions, and you can catch up on ones that were previously done or ones that are coming up now. Look, we've enjoyed having you here. Our next webinar is coming up on the 6th of October. It is with a snapshot of sex in Australia. Join Dr. Patricia Werricoon, and internationally recognised sexologist, and Kamar Werricoon, her son, a Presbyterian minister who's got a wealth of experience applying that research into spiritual contexts and in church. He'll be joined by Scott Sanders, the Executive Director of Geneva Push. So I'll talk about the changing character of sexuality in Australia today and the implications for church. So we would love to have you at that. Join us next time on the planner sessions. Make sure you check out all of them online, genevapush.com/planter sessions. Thanks again to our sponsor, EA Insurance, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks.